Charles Darwin, who in 1809 hatched the egg that poisoned the scientific world, who taught us about evolution.
Charles Darwin taught us about evolution in 1809, the year he was born. Darwin didn't publish his first book on evolution until a half a century later.
There's no way to calculate the damage that is done
because it didn't do any damage at all. Having an accurate understanding of the realities of evolution has been helpful in agriculture and livestock engineering, but especially in virology, toxicology, microbiology, and medicine in general. What causes damage is when you ignore reality to make believe in something else instead, something like creationism, which is not evidently true and worse, is actually demonstrably false. Creationism manipulates and misleads the masses with willful ignorance that is necessarily prejudiced because it is based entirely on lies and nonsense. It's long past time for all of that to stop.
And we have children who are acting like animals because they've been taught that they come from animals.
Children have always acted like animals, in part because they are animals. Even the Bible admits this fact in Ecclesiastes 3:18-21. But historically, children have often acted much worse than other animals because they were taught that they should dominate and subdue the earth rather than respect it. And how can they respect nature when they're taught that that's just the world and that they are not of the world? When the kids are told to pretend as if they are apart from nature, not a part of it, as if they're from some magic, imaginary, immaterial world, that the real world is a fallen and somehow broken and sinful, disgusting place, and that
this life is filled with an immeasurable amount of injustice and suffering.
As if the one life we really get is not to be enjoyed, but endured until you come to the impossible promise of the posthumous paradise that you'll never really see after you die. And these are all indications that you're part of a death cult. It is especially bad among children raised with a religion that teaches how they are better than not just all the other animals, but how they're better than other people, too, especially anyone who didn't believe the same set of lies that Christian kids do. And all this hateful tribalism applies to each denomination within Christianity, which is conflicting with every other denomination, often violently. If there really was a Jesus, he would have put a stop to that before it started.
You say, Adrian, are you against science? No!
Yes, you definitely are, both in principle and practice. This is Baptist pastor Adrian Rogers. He's been dead for a couple of decades now. This sermon is from way back in 1970, but the arguments he used back then were already out of date, and yet they're still being recited now. I will cover a couple points that Pastor Roberts made in another one of his videos later on, because I think there's still a need for it, to compare how creationists used to argue against evolution more than a half century ago and what has changed since then. However, today, I just want to address the little bit that he said about evolution in a speech that was otherwise about the Bible.
Evolution is a philosophy, not a science.
Why does he say that? What he's really trying to do is to imply that evolution is uncertain, that it's not a fact, not necessarily a fact, that it's just a theory. He needs to make it seem as though evolutionary scientists don't really know what they know, so that believers can pretend as if they know what they don't. They don't want reality to harsh their buzz. But let's address his complaint directly. Is evolution a philosophy? At one point, all science was considered to be a subset of philosophy. Science in general was once regarded as natural philosophy. But Rogers doesn't seem to be aware of that. He's trying to distinguish science from philosophy. It's like when believers try to pretend that
Christianity is not a religion. It is a philosophy.
Well, by some definitions, Christianity may be a philosophy, but it's also a religion because it meets all those criteria too, where atheism and evolution do not. At a minimum, every religion must include a body of ethics. In most cases, that is connected with a god, and in nearly every case, there is also a faith-based belief in a supernatural spiritual form that somehow transcends the death of the physical body. Evolution has none of that. It's funny when believers say that Christianity is not a religion, but at the same time they boast that Christianity is the largest and most popular religion in the world. If Christianity were not the leading religion, then Islam would be the world's dominant faith. Christians obviously wouldn't want to admit that either. So they have to recant and admit that Christianity is a religion after all, or else they lose their priority. The point is that we have religious philosophies just like we have the philosophy of science. So, what is philosophy? It is, I think, commonly understood to be a never ending evaluation of basic ideas about knowledge, truth, religion, what is or isn't morally or ethically right or wrong, and the nature and meaning of life. Evolution has little or nothing to do with any of that, but creationists think it does because they have mistaken evolution for a competing belief system. A belief system is where you convince yourself to believe something regardless whether it's true or not because of some imagined value or virtue in believing. Since Pastor Rogers is trying to make believe in biblical literalism, then he has to reject not only evolution, but a bunch of other sciences too, whenever or wherever they conflict with his favorite fantasy. Religious fundamentalists commonly imagine that scientists do the same thing, as if scientists chant mantras like, I believe in the theory of relativity. I believe in the theory of relativity. Faith believers have no idea what it's like to not have faith, to only tentatively accept that something is probably true only when compelled by sufficient evidence to draw that conclusion. They don't know what it's like to weigh multiple hypotheses at once, objectively, trying to see which one is better supported and maybe try to disprove both of them if possible, rather than necessarily believe either one. It's as if believers don't know what it's like to have your mind obligately changed by compelling evidence or logical reasoning, because they've forsaken all of that. Science works because it works opposite of faith. And Pastor Rogers suffered from the very first foundational falsehood of creationism, the false dichotomy that one must either be a science-denying, biblical literalist, religious fundamentalist if you want to believe in God at all, or one must be a purely material atheist, rejecting God and the supernatural in order to accept evolution at all. Pastor Rogers apparently had no idea that virtually all of the pioneers of evolutionary theory were Christians, and that many of the modern scientists who champion evolution today are still Christian. They believe in their religion, and they also accept the science because it's demonstrable, testable, verifiable. Now, what is a science? Science is a method of systematically building and organizing knowledge of the natural world through observation, experimentation, and the testing of theories against predictions and the evidence obtained. Take a look at the simple checklist provided by UC Berkeley in Understanding Science 101. Evolution focuses on the natural world, with everything being explained by natural mechanisms as opposed to miracles. Evolution is the one and only explanation of biodiversity, as even young Earth creationists have to admit that different breeds of dogs and even different species of dogs are biologically related, and that they were derived from a common ancestor by evolutionary mechanisms. Every postulation in the entirety of evolutionary theory is testable and potentially falsifiable by new discoveries or experiments, whether we're talking about mechanisms or phylogenies or what have you. Every evolutionary postulation is based on a body of facts and evidence that are already known. And of course, there is a peer-reviewed process for biology, zoology, virology, paleontology, phylogenetics, and so on, which always leads to ongoing research and benefits from scientific behavior. All of that applies to evolution, and none of it applies to any religion. So Christianity and evolution may or may not be considered a subset of philosophy, depending on what you mean by that. But regardless whether they are or not, Christianity is a religion and evolution is science.
I studied science. I know what the scientific method is. I'm not a scientist, but I know that in science you take a theory, a postulate, you go into the laboratory to see whether it's true or false.
No, a scientific theory is not a postulate. You're thinking of a hypothesis. If you could effectively prove a hypothesis, science would not call it proven. Instead, that hypothesis would be elevated to the level of theory, which is the highest level of confidence science can achieve. In science, a theory is not a postulate or a guess. It is a body of knowledge, enveloping and explaining all the facts, hypotheses, and natural laws within a given field of study. Like atomic theory, for example. It is not a guess that material things are made of atoms. We know they are. Atomic theory explains that. Just like we know that living things evolve, the theory of evolution explains that.
But the evolutionists, they take an idea, say it is true, and then they move heaven and earth to try to prove it.
No, that's what faith does. Believers take an idea, which is just baseless speculation, and they assert it as if it was a matter of fact, as if they knew. We call that lying. Then religious apologists try to rationalize how that could still be true even without any evidence to support it, and despite all the evidence against it, which means they're lying too. But science has a rule that no theory or hypothesis can ever be proved to be true. That's why atomic theory is still a theory, even though we know and can show that, atoms really do make up everything, which is why you shouldn't trust them. Never trust an atom. They make up everything. Likewise, never trust a believer, but same reason. Science won't allow anything to be declared proved positive. The most you could do is disprove something, like the global flood of Noah's Ark, or the Tower of Babel, or the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. All those things have been effectively disproved by science.
But there is no proof.
The official position of science is that proof is absolute and thus limited to mathematics. In that sense, science doesn't even deal with proof. Instead, science is only concerned with whether something is supported or not supported by evidence. That's the yes or no question that everything hinges on. Evolution is supported by evidence. Creationism is not. Creationism is contradicted by the evidence. Evolution is not. But the context of proof that creationists typically use, and that Pastor Rogers is using here, is provisional, like proof in the sense of an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. That we can do just as well with evolution as with atomic theory, cell theory, or the germ theory of disease.
Dr. Newton Tomasian, a physiologist for the Atomic Energy Commission, has said this: scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men, and the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever.
I think it's fair and even defensively accurate to describe religion as a hoax and creationism as fraudulent. If I were to critique that one entire sermon that Pastor Rogers gave on evolution, almost all of it would be misattributed, misrepresented, out of context, or otherwise bogus quote mines like this one. Take the given example. Dr. Theodore Newton Tomasian was born in 1909, a century after Darwin. He died in 1986. And this quote is reportedly from the 1950s, although there's no primary source. It cannot be found where it was said to be. It only appears on creationist websites. In 1948, Tomasian was listed as an associate biologist, but he had not apparently published any papers nor made any discernible contribution to science. He's only notable for his religious extremism. He was an evangelical member of the ironically named American Scientific Affiliation, whose credo includes acceptance of the divine inspiration, trustworthiness, and authority of the Bible in matters of faith and conduct, as well as confessing the triune God affirmed in the Nicene and Apostles' creeds. So, not so much a scientific affiliation as an exclusively religious one. And this was exemplified in a speech that Tomasian gave to that organization, wherein he gets everything about evolution wrong, and he complained about interpretations of the Bible being reconciled with evolution, insisting instead that arguments from authority should override evidence to the contrary. And this logical fallacy is evidently Pastor Rogers' position too. We've learned an awful lot about evolution in a lifetime since this dubious quote, but it's worse than that, because Tomasian's education in evolution would have ended before World War II, even before the discovery of DNA. So he couldn't have known about how genetic divergence estimates based on the molecular clock have consistently matched the absolute radiometric dates given for myriad transitional species found in the fossil record after this comment was made, most of which were not discovered until after he died. He certainly didn't know anything about how computerized genomic comparisons of myriad lineages within the last few decades after his death have confirmed all these phylogenies individually and collectively.
In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact.
Well, I just listed a couple of important ones, and there are lots more we'll get to in a moment, but it is creationism that has not one iota of fact. Creationists like to project their own faults onto others, to switch places and pretend as if their faith is based on evidence, as if science is based on faith in lieu of evidence. But when we're talking about evidence, remember that all religious faiths ever have are logical fallacies, like circular arguments routing back to assumed conclusions, as if the scriptures are both the claim and the evidence of the claim, as if we know that the Bible is true because the Bible said so. And likewise, or otherwise, all believers ever have are what they call testimony: dubious, contradictory, internally inconsistent, unverifiable personal anecdotes, subjective impressions with little or no actual validity. We can't even tell whether these claimed experiences are even real or whether they're just dreams, hallucinations, or made up nonsense, especially because some Christians are trained to witness things they've never really seen. Understand that eyewitness testimony is the least reliable form of evidence, and that all on its own, it's so weak alone that it must be backed by actual fact. And now understand that a fact is a point of data that is either not in dispute, or if it is, then it can be objectively verified, meaning we can both research it independently to confirm that what was claimed actually is true. And then we can ascertain whether that fact counts as evidence, meaning that it indicates one position or eliminates another. And now let me be clear. There is absolutely no actual factual evidence nor logically valid arguments for creationism, and plenty of both against. And conversely, evolution has no evidence against it, but plenty of facts and evidence for it. Let me go over some of those facts for you now. While creationists like to believe in a supernatural creation ex nihilo, that God essentially said abracadabra and poofed everything out of nothing, and they like to pretend that we're the ones that believe everything came from nothing when we don't, we've never seen anything like that. We've never seen anything being created. We've never even seen micro creation. We've never seen enough to show that there even was a supernatural at all. But we have seen evolution in action. It is a fact that evolution happens, that biodiversity and complexity do increase, and that both occur naturally only by evolutionary means. Agricultural geneticists have been confirming this for decades, and farmers have been unwittingly using these principles for centuries. It is a fact that alleles vary with increasing distinction in reproductive populations, and that these are accelerated in genetically isolated groups. We see this at both the micro and macroevolutionary level because they are essentially the same thing. It is a fact that natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift have all been proven to have predictable effect in guiding this variance. And there are many, and I mean thousands, of peer-reviewed experiments and studies to confirm this. And while the vast majority of mutations are neutral and have no effect on selection, there are a few that do. It is a fact that significant beneficial mutations do occur and are inherited by descendant groups. And several of these have been positively identified, what type of mutation occurred at precisely where it was in the genome, and of course, what the effects are and why. It is also a fact that multiple independent sets of biological markers exist to trace these lineages backward over many generations. It is a fact that birds are a subset of dinosaurs the same way that ducks are a subset of birds, the same way that humans are a subset of apes, primates, eutherian mammals, and vertebrate deuterostome animals. And both of these can be conclusively confirmed morphologically, and in the case of humans, genetically too. And of course, that extends to every other living lineage as well. It is a fact that the collective genome of all animals has been traced to its most basal form, and that these forms are also indicated by comparative morphology, physiology, and embryological development. The study of phylogenetics has revealed an intricate network of daughter sets descending from ancestral groups in an ever-branching taxonomic family tree. It is a fact that every animal on Earth has definite relatives either living nearby or evident in the fossil record. Definite meaning that by definition they belong to the same taxonomic clades. It is a fact that numerous radiometric isotopes and other methods have reliably corroborated the sequence of ancient periods of the geologic column that were already indicated by index fossils. It is a fact that the fossil record holds thousands of transitional species, even according to the strictest definition of that term. And most of these were discovered after Pastor Rogers' sermon. It is a fact that both microevolution and macroevolution have both been directly observed, both in the lab and under naturally controlled conditions in the field. Creationists reject that because they don't know what either of these words mean, and they don't want to. They don't want to know what is true because they want to believe what is not true.